So, welcome everybody. I'm really glad to be here and gradually making my way from town to town. Tonight, the focus of the past few years has been thinking about pollinator pathways. And I talked about towns because it's sort of spreading by town. You know, a little group in a town gets interested and then they do their thing. So that's a little bit of an introduction. So we're talking about insects, and they're not really the bottom of the food chain, but they're one of the tiniest things on the food chain, and they're so intimately involved with nature. I like Doug Tallamy, one of the best nature writers, writes about pollinators and native plants, says that for a chickadee clutch of 4 babies, it takes from 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars.
Wow.
Now, where are all those caterpillars?
Yeah.
So a lot of them are in trees. You know, like you're looking at the tree and you go, but I don't see a lot of chewing going on. So an oak tree, for instance, I think is a host to at least 200 different species of insects that lay their eggs there and then they become caterpillars. So it's kind of this miracle of things that are going on behind the scenes. And we see a chickadee, we see a little worm, and they have to gather about 350 to 550 worms a day. So they're busy. And it's protein, and it's extremely important. So we have to do something to make sure that chain of events continues to happen. There's amphibians, there's animals, so insects are important to a lot of different species. And I forgot something. Years ago, I learned that 200 social communities, I'll just say, across the world, 200 eat insects as part of their diet. So, it spreads to humans as well. I just got back from Ireland where I went to a 2-day biodiversity conference, and it was not one of those really high-level, charts and graphs. It was important people who are working in Europe and the British Isles to come up with, nature-based solutions to deal with the biodiversity crisis. And so insects being part of biodiversity, we want to make sure we continue the diversity of the plants that they like, and that will ensure the diversity of the insects. When I say bees, most people think of the honeybee. And the honeybee is not a native. They're from, England, or they're from overseas. So even though, the honeybee is really important to our agricultural community because you can transport the hives where bees are needed. Our group talks mostly about native bees because native bees is something you can help to survive by planting all kinds of native plants. So it's more important for us to focus on the native bee and not think, oh, I have to go out and learn how to be a honeybee, raise honeybees. That's not as important to us. So things I've learned, and by the way, when I started in 2016, I didn't know anything. Trust me, I didn't know anything. But what we've learned is, they don't always just pollinate flowers, but they help the crops. They build topsoil. Insects, this is not just pollinators. They help to build topsoil. They do a lot of biological cleanup. So, you can put stuff in your compost, and guess what? It's insects that devour that and create more soil. And capturing carbon. So these are all free things that insects do. I think I read that they do about $3 billion worth of pollinating for free. Without them, we'd be out there with a paintbrush pollinating corn and whatever we need for food. So they're extremely important. This is kind of a shocker to people. that we have 350 different species of bees in Massachusetts. 350, more than 350. And then 4,000 in the US and 22,000 over the world. And about, I think, at least 25% of them are in decline. So a lot of what we're doing is forcing bees to look for food wider, and it's kind of a sad situation. But I like to think upbeat, like what are we going to do? So that's kind of how I want to have everyone think about this. And other pollinators that we might not think, but bats, ants, moths, you probably know moths pollinate, mostly at night, spiders, wasps, and some hummingbirds, some birds sort of by accident, like they're not all looking for pollen or nectar. A lot of them are looking for nectar, but they just happen to go by, like flies can just go into a flower and then go to the next one. So the bees are the most focused on flower to flower nectar pollen. So the reason for all this decline in the insects, and in all of biodiversity really, corporate farming. So to feed all of us, humans have devised a way of farming, monocultures in huge fields, and oftentimes they use pesticides and herbicides so they don't have to weed. So that's a threat to native species. Urban development. Every time I go to downtown Northampton, I notice how many house sparrows there are, how many robins there are, but there's rarely any songbirds down there. Urban environments tend to have fewer bird species, and so we can change that. We can plant more pollinator plants and flowers in urban areas, and that does work. And then massive pesticides. Something called Roundup is sold on the shelves. It's going to be outlawed, I think, starting in January next year. So it won't be on the shelves of retail. But if you have your license and you know how to use it as a professional, it will be there. But the directions say 1 squirt, and humans go, oh well, if 1 squirt will do something, maybe I'll just do 10 squirts and really make sure. So there's the overuse of pesticides. We should probably get rid of all of them, and that might take a while. So the main chemical that is bad is something called neonicotinoids. These are neurotoxins. The bees will get, or any pollinator will get them from the pollen. The seed can be treated, so some growers are actually soaking seeds in neonicotinoids. They're looking for that perfect flower. And so what happens, and this has been studied widely, is a bee will get slightly poisoned by a flower that has neonicotinoid treatment, and then they can't find their way back to their homes. They get disoriented, and if it's too much, they will die. So about 4 years ago, in the beginning of my organization, we actually called up all the nurseries that we could reach out to easily, and we asked them whether or not their plants were treated with neonicotinoids. And when I called Hadley Garden Center, the woman who answered said, "You're the 4th person that asked that this week." So, it's a little bit of a phone call, but they get the message. And as it turns out, a lot of the conferences that landscapers go to and nurseries for the last 6 years now, they've been, saying, you got to reduce your use of pesticides, you got to reduce. So it's a theme going through it. But I always ask, whenever I go to a nursery or a garden center, I would not suggest going to Lowe's and any of the big box stores, Home Depot. You can look at some of their labels, and on the back it says, treated with XYZ. It's better to go to the local places where you can really talk to the people. You might have seen, I think it was, I can't remember if it was Time magazine or one of those major magazines, where the front cover was a picture of insects, and the cover title was Insect Apocalypse. And that's just what I've been talking about. Armageddon, actually, is what it used. So, and that study said 40% of all insect species are declining. So one thing is really important is that, you could have a whole lecture on this, and I'm not even qualified to do a whole lecture, but plants and insects evolved together. And Darwin proved this. He had a theory because there was a flower that had, it had a shape like this on the outside, and then it had this really, really long inside of the flower. It went like that, and the nectar was down at the bottom. And so he theorized there's got to be a moth that can get to that. And a few years later, they found a moth that had a proboscis that went around just like that, and somebody saw it pollinating that flower. So this is an example of coevolution. And so if either the plant went away or that moth went away, both would die. So there's a theory, and it's not really a theory. There are generalist pollinators who can, you plant some annuals or perennials, and they like everything. They'll just go from flower to flower. They like everything. And there are specialists. So an example is a lot of flowers that have like a little bell on them. Hardly any bees are strong enough to pry it open and get inside where the pollen or the nectar is. Bumblebees. They're fat, they're heavy, and you can watch them. They almost look for the bell-shaped flowers, and they'll go like this, and then they go right in, get the nectar. And so that's an example of coevolution, and very necessary for the bumblebee to exist, for that flower to continue to exist. So biodiversity is my new word. Bumblebee decline is studied recently, and it's really kind of hard to read that, but it's one of the bees that most people recognize. With 350 different kinds of bees, we're not going to get there. I can guarantee we won't. But so many are critically endangered. We just need to find out what we can do, especially in our own yards, and what we can encourage other people to do to make sure they don't collapse. So I noticed the poster that you had out there announcing, it was kind of like this with a lot of different flowers on it, and every one of those flowers needs a pollinator. So, here's your garden, not a club, just gardeners, right? I almost want to say club, but I know you're not a club. The more you do, every plant that you plant is important. And this is not a lecture about how you do that, but one important thing is to plant in clumps. So here you have a little bee. They have to go back and lay eggs and feed their young and everything. If you plant one flower and it's their favorite one, that's all they get. But if you plant in a clump, it takes very little energy for them to go to flower to flower to flower to flower to flower. Sometimes I see monarchs, especially, they fly in the funniest patterns. They come, they're like, and they're looking for something. Maybe it's milkweed or whatever. But the more you can plant in different kinds of clumps, the better you'll be helping the pollinators not use so much energy to get their own food and to get food for their young. So one thing that's really, really frightening is that we have so many other concerns: climate, poverty, racism, ocean pollution, etc. And, I like to think that everybody is paying attention and working on one of those problems, one or more. I like to think that about humans, because everything is so overwhelming, but once you start rolling up your sleeves and trying to do something about one thing, your mood is lifted a little bit. So May in 2021, I was talking about, we formed the Massachusetts Pollinator Network, and the reason I'm taking your emails is because I usually follow up a talk with some resources, and that's the one email I'm going to send. And I'll just, some of the things I mention, I'll mention some resources. And if you would like to get on their mailing list, which isn't often, it's like twice a month maybe, and learn about the speakers that they have, it's all free. So I'll send you information about getting on their mailing list. It's all volunteer, except for the director. We raised money to have a half-time director, but there's a ton of volunteers all over the state. We'd like to find ways of partnering with a town or another nonprofit. So this is a good way. I didn't just have a public speaking. I was invited by somebody, and then more people will find out about what they can do. One thing that happened about the first 5 years that we existed is we learned that you could pass a resolution in your town meeting or the select board, whichever way you want to pursue, where the town will commit to promoting pollinator-friendly plantings, not using neonicotinoids on their own land. They cannot tell everybody else you're forbidden. You can't do that because the state doesn't do that. And so I think there were about 15 or 20 towns that have passed that resolution. The one good thing about having a resolution is if you want it to pass in town meeting, you have to educate a lot of people before the town meeting. So it was a way of educating people about how important pollinators are, not to try to have the perfect lawn with no dandelions, because a lawn with no dandelions is a desert for pollinators and insects. So education is really what we focus on. I'm going to move to talk about pollinator pathways. We used to just talk about planting a pollinator garden. Let's plant a pollinator garden. And you Google on the internet and you learn different things. And I came across a woman in Seattle, professor, who had studied the usefulness of having a whole pathway or a whole corridor that had native plants all along that corridor. It was a 2-mile corridor from her university and the center of town. And her studies showed that it was so much more beneficial to the populations of pollinators to have a corridor. Animals have corridors. The deer and the bunnies and everybody, they have these trails that they go through, and it helps them survive. It helps them live their own lives. So the pollinator pathway, if we look at any kind of development, humans have cut up the landscape. We fragment it. Oh, let's build a road there. Let's put up this huge building. Let's put, sidewalks even. So the idea of a pollinator pathway is to connect the green spaces that aren't anymore connected. And it turns out that if you plant plants that come up really early, like croci, is that the plural of crocus? Croci? If you plant really early and you have flowers really early, it helps the queens that are emerging. And if you leave it till way late, you're helping the bumblebees that are still out there trying to get food. So create a continuous bee buffet. So that's how you would choose your plants to have continuous blooms. And then you're talking about pollinator resiliency. You're talking about creating beauty. I've driven down some streets where it looks like every yard out by the sidewalk strip, every yard has planted some plants. I don't know if they were natives or not, but to see that beauty all along a street. Street's a good place, side of the road, So we started talking more about pollinator pathways, and which could include a lot of separate gardens. So you could have a couple neighbors talk about, hey, if you do that, I'll do this. And then the bees can go back and forth between our yards. So I mentioned the pollinator pathway in Seattle, and I'm going to talk about one in Northampton. Sarah Bergman was the name of the designer of that, and she studied how to design it for 10 years, and then she built it. You know, that's intense. That's really intense. And she helped to design every garden or every strip along the way. She calls it, it's also an art piece for her. So she's a Renaissance woman and thought about a lot more than that. So that's kind of a beacon of how intense you could do it. There are others that are more relaxed, and towns are doing the best they can, but you can start from wherever you are. In Northampton, after I read about that, I'm a biker, I'm a bicyclist, and Northampton has a bike map, which is there on the left, that shows all these bike corridors. And I looked at it and I went, oh, bike corridors? We could have pollinator corridors. And it just gave me the idea to start somehow, how do we start this? And as it turned out, the city had a lot of plantings, you know, municipal, public, easy to see. You walk by them all the time, and I think that's an important part of creating, if you want your pollinator corridor to grow, is to have a lot of it visible and to put a sign up. I plant for pollinators. That does a lot of education. A sign is education in and of itself. So what happened is you might be familiar with Pulaski Park, which is right downtown. It's sort of a gathering place in Northampton, and it has this 200-foot long swale where the water runoff comes into the swale. It's pretty deep. It's maybe about this tall. And they'd hired a professional to design it when they redesigned the whole, I think around 2015 or 14. What happened was a lot of the plants didn't survive. It was a rain garden, water goes through it now and again. And I would say about a third of the plants didn't survive. So a professional, Owen Wormser, went to the city and he said, if you give me a little money, I can turn it into a pollinator garden and replace a lot of the dead plants. So that's how we started. It's 200 feet long, and it's got lots of pollinator plants in it. The beginning of a pollinator pathway, really. And we have 7 different places now in Northampton that are municipal. Another thing is the city had this really steep slope beside their city hall, the one that looks like a castle. It's a super steep slope, and they were mowing it using golf shoes. So, that's ridiculous. If you could never have to mow it, that would be the answer. So Owen also was in charge of picking plants for that. And you know how when you buy plants from a nursery at the end of the year, they look really, really bad. They're all shriveled up, and you go, oh, can I have that for free? So he went out, he got, I think, 600 plugs for the steep slope the same day as we did volunteers planted in the Pulaski Park, 450 there. And after we planted it, we looked at it and we're like, okay, crossing fingers. And within a year, the next summer is the bottom one. The next summer, they were all amazingly big plants. So A, he knew how to pick plants, and B, have faith. So a lot of the common, I want to say too, is native plants. Some people come to this and think, oh, I probably don't know of any of them, they probably got weird names and I couldn't get them anywhere. A lot of the names are things that you already know. Asters, black-eyed Susans, it's Solidago. I mean, a lot of them are ones that we know. And I like to think that, can we plant a few ornamentals if I like them? Because, who doesn't like a daylily? But daylilies aren't really that great for pollinators. A few, but not a lot. So I like to think 70% for nature and 30% for me. I think I've gone to 80% now, but if there's something you like, as long as it's not poisonous to everybody, put it in. But look for the natives. Look for the natives. So a lot of people had walked by a few of the places that weren't being maintained in Northampton. They had a lot of weeds in them, and we recruited a number of volunteers to kind of take over the weeding part, because a lot of city staff, they don't have this training. They know how to mow and they can rake and things like that, but they didn't have this training. So if we wanted it to happen, we rolled up our sleeves. And it's not hard. You call a couple people, let's go weed this afternoon. And the city did partner with us. They agreed if we texted them and told them when we'd have a pile of our weeds and cuttings, they would come pick it up. And they also gave us mulch, bark mulch. So it wasn't all of our responsibility. We did partner with them. There's a lot of communication, and they were, relatively pleased with the results. The volunteer model. So we were lucky that Owen Wormser stepped forward. He's a professional landscape designer. He has a for-profit business, but he and one of his partners created a nonprofit, and that some of their time is used to help towns start gardens. And some of them are just enormous and fantastic. The other side of it is he wants help in recruiting volunteers. So you might know of Bread Euphoria on State Street. There's a big amphitheater of plants out front, and it's amazing. It was a partnership with Smith, with the city, with the bakery, and like 100 volunteers. So you can make it happen, got to organize it well, and getting that professional help is not mandatory, but it sure does help if someone can, guide you a little bit along the way. Great Barrington. I have to mention Great Barrington because they're a champion. In 2017, they hired the Conway School of Landscape Design to create a pollinator action plan for Great Barrington. I mean, they're not free. The School of Landscaping, they must have charged at least, $5,000 or something like that. So the Agriculture Commission coughed up the money. I'll send this in the email that I sent out. It's 90 pages long in large type, and it's a toolkit. It's not written technically at all. It's, okay, what do we do with the side of the road? Okay, what do we do with making a meadow over here? What about in front of our building? It's just accessible by the average person, but professionally done. And they are now implementing a lot of the ideas at schools, on the side of the road, creating some meadows. It's a slow process, but I always look to them as a great example of how volunteers can partner with the cities. Another website you must go to see, and when I went to it first, there were, I think, 35 towns in southwestern Connecticut were starting to build pollinator pathways. I even think this 125 is an old number, but it kind of just grew town to town to town. And their website has links to almost every town, so you can just go and briefly look at what kinds of projects they did and how they raised money and things like that. It's hopeful if it's really spreading like that, because they use signage. They have I don't have a picture of their sign, but they came up with a small metal sign, it says Pollinator Pathway, and because they're doing it so many places, you see it almost everywhere, and it makes you go, oh, what's that? So I'm really enamored with what they've been able to do. This is an example, one town, Wilton, and all of these, the ones that have like purple butterflies, those are actual plantings in Wilton. So it includes residences, of course. And then I forget what the blue ones are. It's somewhere, but there's different symbols, but the ones with the purple are definitely actual plantings. So it grows and grows and grows. If you go to their website, you can actually see the whole Northeast and all the plantings, and then you go, wow, people are really doing something here. So it's very inspiring. So the design of a pathway, one thing that we have available to us is Dr. Robert Jagir, UMass Boston, UMass Dartmouth, what is he? He's a biologist, has done a lot of the studies on the diversity of plants that you need to support the declining bee. So we have to think about, Massachusetts used to have 17 bumblebee species, and it's like down to 11 now. So which are the species that are declining, and what kinds of food do they like? What plants do they really like? So he's created a list of those plants, and again, they're not really strange plants. What do these declining species like? And we're just promoting those species so you know you're kind of doing something for the declining species. And then Evan Abramson is a talented former planner. He's created some garden designs with a list of species, plant species for shady gardens, sunny gardens, wet gardens, hot and dry, like right beside a road where it can get salty and very dry. So he has 5 different planting designs. Oh, and a bee lawn. What do you do to create a bee lawn? So it's inspiring that they've taken all this time to do this. And then Evan is actually doing projects all over the state where a town can hire him to design a really big pollinator project, and then volunteers do all the work. Shrubs are important. Trees are important. Perennials, of course, even annuals. I love the Mexican sunflower, Tithonia. So many, you see so many species on that, and it's pretty too. Host plants. So have you heard the term host plant before? So a lot of the species will only lay eggs on one kind of plant. So if you don't have milkweed of any kind, you're not going to get monarchs. That's an example. Violets, there's some kind of a skipper, I think, that only lays their eggs on violets, et cetera, et cetera. So if you don't plant the host plant. And we have dozens of species of moths and butterflies native to Massachusetts, and each one of them is looking for a particular plant. And we know the cabbage butterfly moth can find our cabbage really easily, and our broccoli. So they'll host on anything. So I think host plant is a good concept to learn more about. Again, volunteers, this is at our senior center in Northampton. We had about 3 days where we worked on it, and now it's amazingly beautiful. We don't weed too much, I must say. We don't weed too much. If it's right in front of Town Hall, we would weed more, but usually they're off a little bit, and you can't tell. So if you are thinking about building a pollinator corridor between several houses or in the town, I think one thing is to, do we want to have more sustainable land care? And you went to our Sustainable Land Care Symposium. At Smith, yes. Yeah. So we had towns and professionals came to that. And, it's all about doing stuff that nature likes versus doing stuff that makes it look perfect for humans. Ironically, Smith College wanted to put meadows everywhere, but is anyone a Smith alumni? Oh, okay. Okay, so the alumni got kind of upset about that. They want to see the perfect lawn. I hope that changes, I think finding out what the town is already doing. Do you have some flower beds somewhere? Is there a problem area near some of the municipal buildings that might, use some volunteer work? What about beside the roads? I mean, just talking to people who are in DPW or whatever your departments are, Conservation Commission. Are there any new buildings being planned? I think you already have a very beautiful newish building. But what Greenfield did when their community center was being planned is some volunteers just elbowed their way in and said, we want a big pollinator garden, not grass. And it came to be. They were persistent. They offered professional help. And so now they have a very nice pollinator garden out front. Also, one thing about, I think this comes up a little bit later, and we have 8 more slides, just so you know. If you could get the town to mow less often. Now, this is a more rural town, but they don't have to mow every week. We don't have to mow every week. A study was done by UMass in Springfield where they had some volunteer yards. I think they had about 20 yards. A third of them were mowed every week, a third of them every 2 weeks, and a third of them every 3 weeks. And volunteers, part of the project, did the mowing. And then they analyzed how many flower species were in the lawns and how many insect species were in the lawns. The least amount of flowers and insects was every week. The most amount was 3 weeks. There was a lot of increase in the 2 weeks. Nobody liked how the 3-week one looked. You know, everyone was complaining. But 2 weeks, nobody complained about mowing every 2 weeks. It looked good enough, you know. So that there was more diversity of insects and non-grass, you know, so flowering things in the lawns at the 2 weeks. So getting a town to mow less often. It's really hard. We've mentioned it in Northampton. They even mow the cemeteries every week, you know? Persistence, right? So new buildings, if there is a new building, getting started early in the project, because oftentimes they already hired someone to design the landscaping. The earlier you get involved before they've done all the planning work. And volunteers can do something to commit to helping to maintain it. That's the only way that Owen Wormser was able to work with the city of Northampton. He said, I will recruit volunteers to help weed it and keep it going. And the city said, okay, you can do it, you know, because they didn't know how to do it and they didn't want it to look terrible. And it doesn't, because volunteers are on it. Maybe there's multiple sources of volunteers. You have to think, look at all the seniors that are out there. My philosophy is people are waiting to be asked to do something good. It's, you know, never be ashamed or hesitant of asking somebody. You don't have to, you know, wrestle them, but I think when someone gets set, you know, we're planting this beautiful pollinator garden. Next Saturday, we need 4 more volunteers to help put them in. They're waiting to be asked, and it's such a good feeling when you're working with a team of people. You're all there. I just did a weeding session with the mayor of Northampton, the head of the planning department, the head of the DPW. They just put a call out, we really need to weed again in Pulaski Park. And there were like 10 of us. And at the end of the day, I'm weeding with the mayor, for instance. She's way too important to do that. No, she was out there having a great time. So there's something about camaraderie when you're doing something public and it's for the good. I mentioned signage. The lower left-hand corner, the orange one, was the sign that we created. We actually raised money with this sign. I got a good price on printing them, and we made about 200 or 300, and we sold them at a higher rate, and it helped us put on that conference. So all kinds of signage could be thought about. There's many different things you could just use that's online somewhere, but think about some kind of signage if you're going to do anything, even in your own yard, you know. We plant for pollinators. It makes it okay if someone sees it a little messy, because, you know, native flower beds can be a little bit more messy than a conventional, you know, planting. But with a sign that says planting for pollinators, everyone goes, okay, all right, that's good. And I go back to the use of clean plants, non-pesticide, you know, nothing with pesticides or herbicides in it. And always ask, you know, don't assume that just because they say native plants for sale, they still might be using some kind of pesticides. And now, you know, we're all aware of jumping worms. And so we have to ask that question too. Do you know you don't have jumping worm eggs or blah, blah, blah? We do what we can. We do the best we can. So pollinator-friendly yards. And this is important because most of us have the places where we live. It's the garden, the flowering part of our yard is smaller in area than the yard part of our, the lawn part of our house. So some of the principles are try to use 70% native plants, mow less often, that's a good one. Sometimes you want to clean up immediately when it starts to get cold, but a lot of native insects overwinter in those leaves. So, try to reduce the amount of cleanup you do in the fall. And in the spring, we always say when the queen bumblebees, when you first start seeing bumblebees, which could be like in the middle of April, middle to end of April, then it's okay to start cleaning up. If you clean up before that, like if you cut down every empty stem, well, there's different kinds of native bees that make their homes in those empty stems over the winter. So you have to be thinking about how much do I really need to clean up. Find out more about that. You could put clover in your lawn, you could put more violets in your lawn, and never leave, never use pesticides or herbicides. That's the best thing you can do. Also, if you observe perennials in the winter, and a lot of them have seed heads, you're going to see a lot of birds visiting those seed heads all winter long. Really, really important food. So and they have such visual interest, a lot of perennials over the winter. They're brown, but some of them are reddish and some of them are purplish. They have visual interest and know that it's food for our wonderful birds. So long range, I think it's already starting. People are a lot more aware of the crisis with the climate and biodiversity, and people say to me all the time, I don't think I saw many monarchs this year. They say it in this kind of hushed tone. I don't think we have as many birds as we used to have. Now, I think we're kind of, our emotions are kind of, some of that is true and some of it's not true. We don't see them, maybe we're not looking for them. I know things are dwindling, but sometimes we're so afraid of it dwindling, we think it's dwindling even more. So I want to think positively that we're going to do it as a garden, not club, group of gardeners. That you're already, you have your sleeves rolled up and you're distributing plants, get more people to use native plants. So thank you so much. That's all I have for tonight, but I'm open for any kinds of questions.
So let's say thank you to Peggy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.